Okay, so at the time of recording and hopefully uploading this, 2.6 should be coming to a close. And this thing is going out a lot later than I would have liked, but we're going to be talking about 2.6 today. Now, the title of 2.6 is Folie et Raison, Madness and Unreason, and based on that title, you would be correct in assuming that the chapter does indeed contain copious amounts of both. But what is madness exactly? How do we define it? Is it something that we can categorically describe, or are we just basing the judgment on vibes? Well, if we go by Google's definition, madness is either the state of being mentally ill, especially severely, or extremely foolish behavior, or a state of frenzied or chaotic activity. So that basically settles it, right? Well, maybe not. These definitions are very, very vague, and rightfully so. The perception of madness in society has seen several shifts over humanity's course, and more often than not, the insane are defined through social metrics rather than medical or scientifical ones. And French philosopher Michel Foucault explored this evolution in his book, which was the namesake for this chapter. Again, Folie et Raison. And if you were paying attention while going through the chapter, the man himself is actually name-dropped as the progenitor of the Comala experiments, the Foucault Society. Now, Foucault's book reads less like a definition of madness and more its chronology. He examines how the perception of the mad shifts through European history through three distinct phases. The first is the Renaissance, where the mad were seen almost as symbols of the human condition. They were thought to harbor some sort of cosmic knowledge beyond the ken of humanity, and because of that, held some degree of value to society as strange interlocutors, right? Then after that comes the classical age, in which the mad were instead segregated and treated almost as beasts of burden. Insanity was a regression to something lesser. The idea was that madness was a moral failing and that a strict and controlling regimen and hard labor could eventually correct aberrant behavior. And lastly is the modern era, in which the focus shifted to confining and curing the mad. Here, the physician became the central authority of the asylum, in that he had the final say in who was and was not insane. And while ostensibly this power was vested in him for the goal of furthering scientific progress, Foucault claims a moralistic purpose. It was better for social order to imprison and isolate those who deviated from the norm. In all of these differing phases, madness is not a medical condition, but a social one. The very definition of madness was a construct of power to punish and correct those who displayed what social mores deemed aberrant or antisocial behavior. Something that we see almost verbatim in this chapter, right? The prisoners of Comala are all there for very similar reasons. They were considered undesirables in their homeland, spreading ideology that was incompatible with the powers that be, and were thus expelled, and because of that, all deemed mad. But not just them, right? In a sense, everyone in the prison is mad. The inmates, of course, right? The jailer, who, beyond her zealous adherence to regulation, has lost all sense of self or belonging. Aleph, who in his quest for transcendentality, discarded his humanity and fractured his mind. And even Recoleta could be considered mad, right? You could even say that she is actually the maddest of the bunch. Every aspect of her obsession permeates her being as a direct consequence of who and what she is. Against the advice and warnings of literally everybody she's ever come into contact with, she pursues one singular goal to an almost self-destructive extent: the revival and celebration of visceral realism. And on a metatextual level, even this very pursuit can be considered a form of nonsense, of madness, because visceral realism does not exist. It is not and was not ever an extant literary movement. Visceral realism is fictional, written in the book The Savage Detectives by Robert Bolaño, and to an extent Recoleta's path mirrors the progression of this book. An artist in pursuit of the purest form of their work seeks an almost mythical figure for guidance, coming into contact with eccentric poets along the way. In the book, the hunt for this dubious figure leads them to the progenitor of visceral realism, Cesarea Tinajero, while here, Recoleta eventually manages to meet Aleph himself. And while Recoleta is mad, yes, she harbors a clarity that everyone else seems to lack. Of all the madmen in the prison, she is the one who chooses to embrace reality for what it is, yet still opts to continue in her mad pursuit. When it comes time for Don Quixote to awaken to the world, she is the only one of them all who leaps boldly back into the fray. But why? What differentiates one madwoman from the scores of others inhabiting Kamala prison? Well, I think part of the difference is the purity within their goals, right? While the inmates of the prison pursue perfect poetry, they are still ultimately bound up by hierarchy and power structures. Their quest is tainted to the point of infeasibility. Much like the book that it is based on, and much like Recoleta herself, La Sociedad is fiction. It has no true meaning or purpose, only meandering rhetoric with no conclusion. It is theory without practical application, its participants isolated from the demands of the greater world, where they cannot affect any form of actual change. Comala is a prison, and it is also a festering cradle. It confines and sequesters all ideals that are anathema to a functioning society, of reckless indulgence and self-defeating pursuits, of radical movements and the yearning for an unattainable perfection. It nurtures that which will rot and stagnate in the very place that it was birthed. La Sociedad cannot exist beyond the confines of the prison. When broken from its shell and exposed to reality, it literally goes up in flames. Similarly, Recoleta, a literary ghost, should not be able to exist beyond her own story. She, like Comala, should have disappeared when exposed to the truth, but she didn't. Right? In an ironic twist, it is the product of fiction that understands and yearns for a connection with reality far more than any of the flesh and blood inhabitants of the prison. Recoleta was never content to remain solitary in her pursuit of pure literature, and that proved to be her saving grace. Upon the destruction of her story, she is returned to Amalfitano, returned to the place that she recognizes as home, surrounded by people that she recognizes as friends and family, and she's then presented with a choice: accept the truth and end her journey and finally rest, or continue the pursuit and return to reality. And here she diverges from her Quixotic inspiration. Don Quixote died filled with regret and shame, his dream discarded. Returned to his home, he recognized the folly of his pursuit and the glorious delusion that had consumed his life. He renounced the chivalric stories that he had once loved, choosing to remain firmly planted in reality for his final moments. An ignoble end for a beautiful journey. But for Recoleta, a denizen of fiction, her return to reality is merely a continuation of the adventure. When faced with the choice of remaining in her home, she instead leaves, never to return, the wandering knight of literature once again. And this difference between Recoleta and Comala is the reason that one flourishes while the other perishes. So adamantly did she spread her story that it persisted after her physical destruction, after her death, granting her a path back to reality. She is the embodiment of an idea, and because she propagated that idea, she was not forgotten. But La Sociedad never cared to spread their work or interface with society. They are the Quixotics who chose to rest. Like Don, each and every one of them denounced the cause that placed them in Comala to begin with. They denounced the greater world and took solace in the fiction of La Sociedad, chasing fairy tales. There was no path back to reality for them. They had long since forfeited it. So when it all goes up in flame, all they can do is dance, to revel one final time in the ashes of all that they have left, and then even that too is gone. The entirety of Folie et de Raison can be considered a lesson in temperance, right? Passion must be bridled with reason, fiction regulated with reality, the reptilian complex governed by the neocortex, the poets are kept in line by the jailer, the idealist resisted by the physician. An equal and opposite reaction to every action, and to sway too far either way is to then invite its own form of madness. We see this with Aleph, a human and supposed champion of rationality who becomes too rational. In his bid to obtain all the knowledge of the cosmos, he discards his own humanity. He understands logically why things are the way that they are, but is now unable to attach moral weight or human emotion to it. In a sense, no better than a machine carrying out directives even beyond the point of feasibility. We see this with Recoleta, whose pursuits more often than not prove unfruitful, leaving her destitute and alone, with the only thing keeping her going being her own interminable stubbornness. We see this with Miss Hunting, who provides the Sancho to Recoleta's Quixote. Though she loves literature, that passion is tempered by reality's demands, and while Recoleta manages to rekindle her love for the art, their paths still must ultimately diverge. And I find myself having to agree with Miss Hunting. Recoleta is a symbol for an ideal. She is absolute devotion. She is the obsessive passion for something pure, But like most pure ideals, what she symbolizes is incompatible with the real world. And more than anything, more than her origins or her nature, that is why she is fictional. But you know what isn't fictional? The absolute crunch that I went through trying to get this thing out before the patch's end. I mean, at least I made it, right? Meanwhile, the 2.5 script is still hanging out in limbo somewhere, so I guess it could be worse. But that's going to be the video. Thank you today for supporting me on Patreon, and thank you to Pompa Aerostar, Bones and Apples, Fructose Tolerant, and Chip for becoming members on YouTube. Additionally, another thank you to Chip for the 5 gifted memberships. I really just cannot express how much I appreciate the support. And to everybody else, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will be seeing you on the next one, okay? Bye-bye.